Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all, Canada's most irreverent talk show here, the Andrew Lawton Show on True North. Although I've learned as of this morning, I probably could have had another calling. Now, I wasn't even going to talk about this. We're going to do this on Off the Record tomorrow. So if you want like the full reaction and the full experience of just talking about how crazy and stupid this is, do it. But I also couldn't not talk about it because it landed on my desk like, 25 minutes ago. I mean, not literally, that would have been very strange, but figuratively landed on my desk. So you may recall back in, I think it was December or November, I think it was November, the federal government sent this massive delegation to Dubai for COP28, which is like the big grand climate summit. And I just got back from Dubai. It's a lovely, lovely city. It is very beautiful, very global. It's weird in a way. I'm actually writing a column to this effect because it's this like post-national place where none of the people who live there are actually from there. But I didn't know that Dubai had played home to what I think is probably the worst musical performance since Sophie Gregoire Trudeau sang a song that no one asked for about on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. But I don't know. She's got nothing on. What's this guy's name? His name is Baba Dirkman, is it? It's not on my notes here. I think his name is Baba something or other. But you won't want to look it up because you're not going to want to hear anything else from him after this banger. Do we not have the alleged banger? I guess we don't have the clip. Okay, well, we'll play the clip later. I set it up so well. Okay, we're going to play this clip very shortly. Yeah, it's the rap clip, Sean. It's the rap clip. All right, here we go.
All right, I don't even know what it says. Climate disinformation, get that immunization, the vaccine for bad meme infiltration. Climate misinformation, it leads to polarization, which leads to radical conspiracy ideation. Simultaneous translation between conspiracy theories and violent means of change embracement. Economic incentives or ideological basis, it doesn't matter, because either way it's still disinformation. Climate change is upon us, and emissions are like a bomb as the wave of increasing heat carries on and on. The wave of disinformation keeps on getting shared online, tracked by the lab of Marie-Eve Carignan from Université Sherbrooke. According to her book, the anti-government left and right now share a yearbook. And when it comes to floods, droughts, and wildfires, even today's environmentalists can be climate deniers. Those are the yoga QAnon people up in the mix. Marie-Eve tracks the patterns with the acronym FLIC. False X words, fallacious logic, unrealistic expectations, cherry picking and conspiracy theory ideation. That's FLIC. Advertisers can help us find the fix. The climate host is exposed, brought to you by Wix. From the false promotion of bad pollutions and tricks to the outright denialism saying it doesn't exist. There's a reason for the IPCC. It doesn't make assumptions. Make your advertising conscious. Take it from Jake Dubbins. Yes, we need free speech to get the facts in the fight. But like Jake said, ad revenue is not a human right.
That... I'm sorry. So you paid for that. You as a Canadian taxpayer paid for that. That was a guy, his name, I looked it up. His name is Baba Brinkman. Not Baba Black Sheep. I believe they're brothers. Baba Brinkman is a New York-based rap artist, and he does science-themed albums and off-Broadway theater productions. Probably off-Broadway, like New Jersey off-Broadway. Anyway, tiny little relevant tidbit, I think, worth mentioning. His mother is a Liberal member of Parliament. His mother is Liberal MP Joyce Murray, which may or may not have influenced the Canadian government's decision to fly him to Dubai to do a rap about climate disinformation. You can probably make it all your ringtone. Give 99 cents to Al Gore, and you can make that your ringtone, or David Suzuki. I can't remember which one. This was at the Canada Pavilion, which, according to our friends at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we paid, $1.3 million to put together. $3 million. $3 million to put this together. This is the 1.3 million. Oh, yeah, sorry. 1.3 million is for the for the pavilion. 3 million was the overall cost. But basically, we are to feel better about it because we've been wrapped to by the son of a Liberal member of Parliament. The left loves talking about cultural appropriation. I'm more offended by that than I am by anything that someone would wear as a Halloween costume. But okay, we'll have more on that tomorrow in Off the Record. But like I said, I could have had that career. I could have been flying around the world to rap about climate disinformation. Instead, I'm here in my basement. So take from that what you will. It's a cruel, cruel world. What I actually wanted to talk about today, and I still have left myself a few minutes to do it, was the CRTC's decision to delay implementation of the so-called Online Streaming Act. Now, this is the bill that the government uses to regulate what you see on the internet. They are saying that there isn't enough Canadian content on YouTube, on Netflix, on Spotify. So the Canadian government is going to force these platforms to rejig their algorithms to show you more Canadian content, which means government picking and choosing what you see on the internet. Now, they've also said that these platforms will have an obligation to produce more, to invest in more. So we now have the government basically exacting money from the Netflixes and Spotifys of the world, and doing so because they believe we need more Canadian content like that rap I just showed you. So the government will make it so that YouTube produces far more of that and less of, I don't know, some Spanish soap opera you want to watch clips of on YouTube. But all of that notwithstanding, what's interesting here is that we have a delay. The CRTC is the one that's forced to actually make this work. And according to the CRTC itself, they are going to be pushing further and further down the pipeline. So they've actually published a timeline here. They've published a roadmap, and they're now saying full implementation isn't going to be until late 2025. Late 2025. Now, what is 2025? What is the significance of that? Well, that also happens to be when we have scheduled a federal election. That federal election is, coincidentally enough, later in 2025. It is in October, unless there is an earlier election, which is always a possibility, although we don't yet know for certain. But let's just run the timeline here. The CRTC is still building a regulatory framework. They're having consultations. They're talking to this group and that group. They're going to have a consultation on closed captioning in the summer of 2024. So that's sure to be a riveting thing that we won't be live streaming, I promise you. And it's not until when we talk about implementing it, they say targeting launch late 2025. So they're going to make all these decisions, then they're going to focus on implementing them in late 2025. And this is how they describe it. The CRTC will finalize the contributions online streaming services and traditional broadcasters will have to make to support Canadian and Indigenous content. We will also start to issue conditions of service that reflect how each TV station, radio station, and streaming service should support the goals of the broadcasting system. More details will be included in future updates. So this is predicated on government even being able to do this all by the end of next year, which I think is a big, big question mark as to whether government is capable of doing that. But it also coincidentally means that the government is going to be, the Liberal government is going to be forced to defend this throughout the next election campaign. And again, the beleaguered Liberal government, I don't think wants to run on a platform where they've got to defend the carbon tax, which is already going to be a big pressure point for them, and also have to defend why they're focusing, while Canadians are struggling with cost of living, on regulating podcasts. If you're to go door to door, as many political candidates in this country are and will, and ask people, what are your top 10 concerns from Canada? I don't think anyone, certainly anyone outside of Quebec, is going to list it all in the top 10. You know, I really don't like my YouTube homepage. So when you get to Ottawa, I really want to make sure that you tackle what I see when I log on to YouTube. Now, when I go to YouTube now, I'm not going to read what's there because you'll learn about my taste in music and you will forever judge me more harshly than you already do. I've got a Gordon Ramsay clip there. I've got a couple of clips from Penn and Teller's show. I've got the Guantanamera song because someone mentioned Guantanamo the other day and it made me think of the song. I've got my own show. That's good. My own show. I see myself right now talking back to me. Let's see. I see a clip of Justin Trudeau, and I see a comedian I like who I don't think is Canadian. So right now, there is a selection of videos available to me on YouTube, which has been curated based on things that I like and things that I click on. One of them is Canadian. Well, two of them. The clip of Justin Trudeau, which I could take or leave, and the live stream that I'm doing right now are the two Canadian things. Well below the statutory threshold that we are going to get for Canadian content and the regulatory threshold from the CRTC. So already we have by design a policy that is aimed at manipulating this. Now, what forms of Canadian content do you think the government is going to be putting on people's homepage? Do you think they're going to be forcing the Andrew Lawton show onto, Mabel's YouTube homepage? No, they're going to be forcing some crappy CBC sitcom. They're going to be forcing some hackish stand-up comedian. They're going to be forcing that rap about climate disinformation. That's the type of Canadian content they're going to be pushing. So if you don't think this is a significant issue, you're not paying attention, and you should, because it's not benign. It's not just about supporting Canadian content and Canadian artists. It's about manipulating what every single Canadian can do and see on the internet. And I'll use myself as an example here. When my Freedom Convoy book came out a couple of years ago, Indigo didn't put it on the shelves, and we, criticized them for it, and that's fine. But they made the decision to not do it. And they said, well, it's still available on our website. If someone really wants it, they can get it. But the point is, there is a tremendous value in a book being on the shelves to expose itself to people that otherwise wouldn't know it was there. You walk into a store, you see a book. Oh, wow, I didn't know there was a book about the Freedom Convoy. I'm going to buy it. That's what homepages for streaming services are as well. Spotify serves up music they'll think I like based on music they know I like. They're not going to do that as well if they're focused on serving up a mandatory quota of Canadian music. Not to say there isn't amazing Canadian music, but sometimes that's not what I'm after, or you're disproportionately choosing these things. And that's the problem with this. So to bring it back to why it's relevant now, the fact that the CRTC is delaying it, I actually think is a tremendous source of relief for Canadians. Keep delaying it, keep delaying it. Let this be an election issue so that you could have a Conservative government say, if this is what the Conservatives choose to campaign on, that says the first thing we're going to do is dismantle this, go right back to the old way. And all of a sudden the CRTC, yes, will have wasted the work, but it means that Canadians will be further in control of their podcast, their streaming, because again, it's going to limit what podcasts you see. This is a policy that says we need more of, Canada Land and less of Joe Rogan, which may or may not be true, but it's a choice that consumers, that viewers and listeners to podcasts should decide, not bureaucrats and regulators in the CRTC. We'll move from this issue to a much more real constitutional matter, and that is the decision that came down yesterday from the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal, upholding a ban that the government had on gatherings outdoors. Now, one of the things, and this came up the other day, there was a gentleman who I've interviewed in the past, Kevin Gaudette, who was fined for not staying in a quarantine hotel. And he had shared about this on a thread on X. And I had said when I retweeted it or quote tweeted it, that how surreal it seemed that this was something we went through, that the government was locking people up in quarantine hotels and giving massive, massive fines. I said, but it's not surreal. It was very real. Government did it. And they have tried to basically forget this. But the legal process moves slowly at times. These things are still working their way through the courts. And with the exception of maybe a small handful of cases, courts have made absolutely abysmal decisions on this. The one in Saskatchewan, which we'll talk about shortly, and also this week in British Columbia, the BC Supreme Court has upheld the healthcare workers' vaccine mandate, which is pretty much as unscientific at this stage as a gathering restriction on outdoor gatherings of more than 10 people. Joining me on the line now is Marty Moore. He leads a team of lawyers across Canada funded by the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms. And just as a matter of disclosure, I sit on the board for the JCCF, although that has no bearing on this interview. Marty, good to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Good to talk to you. Thank you, Andrew.
So let's start with what the actual decision was in Saskatchewan. I mean, this was a clear-cut freedom or a constitutional freedoms case. Your right to assemble, your right to gather outdoors, and the Court of Appeal has still said the justifications that the government held were reasonable.
That's right. And the word reasonable there is obviously doing a lot of work. The court has upheld a lower court decision that found that it was just fine for the government to prohibit people from protesting outdoors with any more than 10 people. And if you have a gathering of 10 people outdoors and you call that a protest, you're really stretching already. While simultaneously, the government was in fact allowing much greater people to gather indoors. And the facts in this case, Andrew, were not controversial. This was not a great battle of the experts, if you will. Everybody was admitting it's much safer to be outdoors. In fact, there was no evidence whatsoever of a single COVID transmission linked to an outdoor protest during the entire period of COVID in Saskatchewan. But yet, when it came to restaurants and bars, the public health officer there was estimating 30 cases a day from those restaurants and bars. And guess what had the restrictions? Outdoor protests did. And in a bar, you could gather, as long as you only have 4 people at a table, you were fine in Saskatchewan. But don't gather with more than 10 people outdoors in a park, regardless of how far you are apart. So this is the current decision that's come down. The court says, well, government is required deference, and the precautionary principle needs to be respected here as well, Andrew.
And what is that for people that haven't had to spend their lives immersed in this like you have?
Well, the precautionary principle is designed to allow for government to make decisions where there's a lack of evidence and there's a high risk of harm if they don't act. Well, here in this case, it's been known for decades and decades that respiratory viruses don't transmit outdoors with any significant or real risk there. But yet, in the case of COVID, we threw all of our past knowledge out the window and claimed that the precautionary principle needed to be used to ban things that the government really, had problems with, like an outdoor protest, which, obviously is the only way for people to really voice their objections to the government's current policy. Now, the precautionary principle was applied, in a bizarre way in Saskatchewan because, as I mentioned, when you could gather indoors and much more risky settings where there's lots of case spread happening on a daily basis, we don't apply the precautionary principle to that. That's economic activity. But when it comes to these pesky protesters outdoors, well, we'll apply rigorously the precautionary principle because one of them could get sick, Andrew, even though we have no evidence that anybody got sick, despite mass protests going on during COVID, as we know from the Black Lives Matter protests.
I haven't read the full decision yet, so I didn't see it there, but I wanted to ask you about it because in some of these decisions in other courts and other similar fact patterns, but different cases, judges will hedge by saying, well, based on the information at the time, and they'll kind of give government a bit of a weasel way out there by saying, well, it might have been reasonable for them to think that this was a reasonable policy. Is that something that was engaged here as well?
Well, certainly the decision tries to say we can't, second guess decisions made during the time. But these were decisions that were months and months in the making. The 10-person limit was initially in place during the Black Lives Matter protests. It was never enforced during that time, of course. Then it was reimposed in the winter there. That entire time period, we have statements from the chief medical health officer in Saskatchewan saying it's much safer to be outdoors, please gather outdoors, and even statements commenting on protests that look, it's a restriction, it's guidance not to gather with more than 10 people, but we totally get people's desire to be outdoors protesting for Black Lives Matter. That was not applied, of course, when it came down to people protesting government restrictions, in which case the weight of the law was brought down with full force and a vigor actually unmatched in any other province, and we're national across the country. I have not seen a greater prosecution and zeal to punish those who prosecuted or who protested government restrictions than I've seen in Saskatchewan. And those prosecutions are actually going on in this day. We've had dozens of cases there in Saskatchewan on that basis, but only those protesters against the government, no one that was protesting other issues, Black Lives Matter, Palestinian Israel issues, or even LGBTQ matters. All of those things were going on as well. They were all subject to the same restrictions, but only one group was targeted. So there's a real rule of law issue here in Saskatchewan as well.
There's a part of this that I find particularly insidious. Now, I think any restriction on freedom to protest is a very serious thing, but it's especially concerning when government puts a policy in place that innately and directly prohibits protest of that policy. Because you're basically saying that you should not be allowed to express legally your displeasure with the very thing that we're using to prevent you from doing it.
Absolutely. And that's why the courts are there. That is why, under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it's a fundamental freedom to peacefully assemble and express publicly in this very powerful medium your opposition to government action. And when we see, in this case, the courts repeatedly using deference to the government for this kind of direct prohibition, it is shocking, and it's very much a concern. And to be honest, Andrew, the courts in Canada on the issue of COVID restrictions have really failed to earn Canadians' trust. And when they say, look, and just quoting from the decision itself, it's like, even if the differential treatment between unstructured outdoor gatherings and retail settings could not be justified on an entirely public health rationale, which is an understatement, the court says, well, that's not really determinative of whether it's justified because the government has deference to, quote, preserve economic activity and other social benefits. And so, in other words, if the government chooses to violate your rights and allow economic activity, which is more risky to go forward, the courts are right now saying we're fine to turn a blind eye to that.
Yeah, I wanted to take a bigger picture look at this. I mentioned in the preamble the BC case this week, and I don't think you were engaged in that case, but I'm sure you followed this in other similar ones. And you're right when you say that there's been this overwhelming attitude of deference. And I'm really hard-pressed to come up with any wins. I mean, obviously, the federal court did shut down the Emergencies Act, which was a positive, I think, decision emanating from that era. But that wasn't actually a COVID restriction or a COVID policy. The Emergencies Act was problematic for other reasons. I mean, where have been the wins on anything else COVID related?
Well, yeah, and I mean, actually, we were involved there in the BC cases and with the medical health workers, and there is a small win there, of course. We do have an order from the court saying Dr. Henry now must reconsider this prohibition of virtual workers. They should be hired back. So there's something there to latch on to.
But that's the way. Is that maybe just maybe it's not reasonable to force people who work from home to get a vaccine. That's about as low a bar as we get in Canada.
Right. And we've now found the courts. This is the first time, as I'm aware, of a court actually being willing to essentially say that. We've seen some arbiters.
And the Canada Post arbitration said something very similar this week.
There, when it comes to COVID restrictions, of course, we filed a case in BC against the ban on outdoor protests. The government actually conceded that violation, and then in Alberta we struck down the restrictions on the COVID restrictions on the basis not of the charter, but on the basis that they were illegally issued by Dr. Dina Hinshaw rather than what they were in fact cabinet regulations. And so when the wins come, they're far and few between on the COVID restrictions themselves. Of course, we've had many victories at trial, many dropped charges, but on the charter merits themselves, the courts have really let Canadians down to this point. The Supreme Court has yet to weigh in. We have seen the Taylor case from Newfoundland recently being granted leave. It's hard to say whether the Supreme Court is going to get to the merits of COVID or whether they're going to get to this issue of mootness, where we've seen courts refuse to even consider COVID restrictions because, that was in the past, Andrew. So that's a live issue in the Taylor case, and maybe the court will get past the mootness issue and get to the merits. We're not sure. But it's a possibility that here, this protest restriction case from Saskatchewan would also be seeking leave from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's been rather not too generous in granting leave to appeal, but it does, I think, behoove the courts to fight back and actually seek to regain Canadians' trust, because the courts are the ones under the Charter through Section 1 that are there to defend Canadians' fundamental rights and freedoms. And when they fail to do that, they lose Canadians' trust. And I think we've seen that significantly in Canada, and a lot more discussion of, maybe if the courts are losing Canadians' trust, it's going to fall to the legislatures to now be the defenders of people's fundamental rights and freedoms. And if the courts agree or not, politicians are going to have more latitude to regard or disregard court decisions.
Yes, I've got a long-standing frustration with mootness, which conveniently allows governments to skirt accountability and then do the same thing again elsewhere. And I mean, I would, not being a lawyer, but I would point out, if the government uses this, that the government at every opportunity talks about the need to prepare for the next pandemic. So they clearly are aware of the fact that this could replicate itself in some form. So absolutely, having on record the actually you can't do this would be very important. Although, as we've been discussing, in fact, the government may end up having on the record a permission slip.
Right. And this is where Canadians really need to, obviously, we're going to continue to press these matters through the courts, but Canadians can also press their politicians. Well, the current Saskatchewan government is the government that put these measures in place. What is that government going to do to promise its citizens to say, look, we're not going to be so unscientific and quite frankly, just completely ignoring common sense on these issues in the future? What restrictions is the government going to put on itself to ensure that itself or a subsequent government will not be violating Canadians' rights with such impunity? Legislatures are, for example, in Alberta, are making some changes in that regard. Public health acts need to be changed. This idea that the government can, based simply on a potential line of reasoning, however tortured, to restrict your fundamental rights and freedoms, well, why should we allow that? We can obviously press this through the courts. I think legislatures have a job to do on this as well.
Marty Moore, always good to get your legal analysis and chat with you in general. Thank you for coming on, sir. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
All right. Yeah, the JCCF's Big George Jonas Freedom Award dinners are coming up. So I think I'll be at the one in, I definitely I'll be at the one in Toronto. I think I'll be at the one in Calgary as well. So we will hopefully catch up with Marty at least one of those, and maybe some of you as well. I know many of you are supporters of that organization and its work. One thing that I will say just before moving on here, which I think is crucially important to point out, is that yes, you need to look at all of the mechanisms available to you. You use the legal tools and use the political tools. But this is where I get very pessimistic, because let's look at the post-pandemic electoral record. We have had a handful of elections in the last few years, and they have revealed that Canadians are willing to give further mandates to the people responsible for some of these policies. Justin Trudeau, reelected in 2021 with effectively the same size of government that he had going into that election. Doug Ford in 2022, reelected. Danielle Smith is the one exception, and that was a case of the internal mechanism, the leadership process in the United Conservative Party getting rid of Jason Kenney. Apart from that, in Manitoba, yes, the PC government lost and was replaced by the NDP, but that really wasn't a rebuke of the former Manitoba government's handling of COVID. So at pretty much every opportunity when Canadians have been able to vote out a government that violated their civil liberties, they have in fact reelected it, or they've, in the case of Manitoba, voted it out without really dealing with that issue. So yes, I think Canadians need to wake up. If we talk about politics as being downstream of culture, it's exactly why we need to keep having these conversations like we are now. But tell your friends too. I never let anyone tell you that a Christmas dinner should be banned or something, because when government drives that wedge between your ability to assemble, they're doing exactly what we were talking about in Saskatchewan there, which is making it so you can't find that you aren't alone, and you can't find there are other people like you that think this is all bonkers, and you certainly can't get together in a group and wave your signs and placards and stand outside a hall of government and say no. So when governments prohibit you from doing that, there's a big, big problem, and you should just protest on principle because they don't want you to. So with that being said, let's talk about another issue where certainly the legal issues have not been solved by the court, so we perhaps have to look for political solutions. And healthcare is a tremendous example of that. Healthcare choice. It's not really something we have universally available to Canadians. If you are in Quebec, you have that option because the Supreme Court has decided you do, but only in Quebec. Not if you live in another province, certainly not in British Columbia. We view healthcare, rightfully so, as a provincial issue, but there was a piece from Colin Craig, who's the president of secondstreet.org, that says we need to put some of the blame on federal gatekeepers as well. He says we should demand healthcare choice from federal political leaders. Colin Craig joins me now. Always good to talk to you, Colin. So let's just explain the basics here. Why is this an issue that is federal?
Well, it's a reality that the federal government gives provincial governments billions of dollars every single year for healthcare. It is a minority position. So when you go to a hospital and you get care or you visit your family doctor, the bulk of the bill is paid for by the provincial government using tax dollars. But Ottawa, they still receive a decent portion. I don't know the exact percentage offhand, but they still receive a decent enough portion that they certainly want to keep Ottawa happy because they don't want to lose those dollars. And so sometimes when provincial governments go to do things that Ottawa doesn't like, they threaten or they actually come in with funding cuts in terms of how much they're giving for healthcare. So that's how Ottawa is tied into this. And it's done through the Canada Health Act, which is basically a funding mechanism in terms of how Ottawa agrees to give provincial governments money for healthcare.
So one of the things that I find just so baffling here, and again, we just had Marty Moore on to do the legal stuff, so you and I don't have to go down the legal road, but the Supreme Court has said, yeah, access to a wait list is not access to healthcare. They've said that you should have the right, if you have the means available, to go and do something else. They've just said this is the case only in one province alone. It would arguably be more of an easy pill to swallow if they had said no across the board. But in this case, someone in British Columbia can't go to the Cambie clinic, but someone in Quebec can go wherever they want to go.
Yeah, and just make a distinction for your listeners, because this can get a bit confusing sometimes. And what people don't always pick up on is that it's getting private or non-government care locally. This is the sticking point. As a Calgarian, if I need a hip operation, I cannot pay in Calgary or anywhere else in Alberta. I can fly to British Columbia and pay to get one there. I can fly to certainly Quebec and other provinces. So you actually have the same problem in BC. Someone in Vancouver cannot pay at a private clinic in Vancouver. They can in Calgary. So you see this happening where people...
And it's the same doctors that could have just served the person in their own province if legal.
Yeah, it's crazy. No other country on the planet does what Canada does in this regard. It makes no sense in terms of cost. You're increasing costs for patients. You're inconveniencing them at a time that usually this is the last thing they need. If you've got chronic pain because you're waiting for a hip operation, like last thing you want to do is jump on an airplane and go somewhere else to get it done. So it makes no sense at all. If you're the federal government, I would point out it's bad for the environment, right? To force people to have to travel even further to get the care they need. But certainly wouldn't criticize any patient for doing what they can to improve the health of their bodies.
So when you talk about this in level-headed terms, I think, wow, this is easy. Why isn't every Canadian getting on board with this? But you bring it into the public realm. Certainly, if a politician were to ever say what you're saying in as dispassionate and mild-mannered a way, they're going to have the activists jumping, saying they're privatizing healthcare, American healthcare. You're going to be no longer served if you don't have money. People are going to go broke. Like, you have all of these doom and gloom scenarios, which... How do you push back against that? I mean, how do you tell people that actually, no, it increases care for everyone?
Yeah, so, I mean, that's really the debate that dominated 20, 30 years ago. And this is why we didn't see any changes back then. The public has shifted. And credit to groups that were around before us, and certainly we've been talking about it for several years now. But the reality is there's not two systems on the planet. It's not just Canada or the US. There are lots of countries that have universal systems like Canada, Norway, Sweden, France, throughout the European Union, Australia, New Zealand. And, many, many reports show that they're doing better than Canada. And the key difference is that they give patients the choice between using their public systems or using non-government options, whether it's a nonprofit clinic, a private clinic, whatever. Patients have that choice. We don't typically have that choice, as we've just discussed in Canada. So I think more and more Canadians understand that. They're on board with it. The polls show that a large majority of Canadians understand that throwing money at the system is not the solution. We spend a lot of money on healthcare in this country. That's not the problem. The problem is that we don't get good results because of the structure of the system. And giving patients choice, it helps take pressure off of the public system. My bet is if we did that across the country, made it easier, the vast majority of people would still use the public system, and that's fine. But you'd probably have maybe around 10, 15% that would use non-government options. I mean, that's kind of been the Swedish experience. And who wouldn't want to take 10 or 15% of pressure off of our healthcare system right now? would be, a significant benefit. And combined with other reforms, we could ultimately deliver better care for patients.
But the response you get to that is, what happens if 10% or 15% of the doctors decide to leave the public system and go to the private system? Then you've not really helped anything. And what's the answer to that?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, because a lot of people raise that point. And what I always respond with is, well, how does Sweden do it? How does Norway do it? How does Australia do it? I mean, all these other countries that perform better than Canada, they have found a way to do it. And often the solution is that they will cap, in the United Kingdom, for example, they cap how much time someone in the public system can work in the private system. The second thing to keep in mind is that when you have more employers, you end up with more employees. This is something that the Swedes told us when we were in their country last year talking with people about healthcare. And I thought this is a great way of explaining it. Because when you have a more vibrant healthcare sector, you have more choices for people in the healthcare sector in terms of where they want to work. Right now in Canada, you often have doctors and nurses graduating, and they look around, and often the option is, well, I work in the government system or I go somewhere else. Well, if they had more choices in Canada, then we could retain more doctors, we could retain more nurses. We wouldn't have the shortages that we have right now.
And I know it's not perfectly analogous, but I would also say that we could look at the education system. It's another regulated professional designation to be a teacher. We have private schools. We have not seen this mass exodus of public school teachers to private schools, because we also forget that people are motivated by different things. People that go into healthcare are motivated by different things. You may really want to be in a hospital and a family medicine practice, and you'll stay in the system because it offers you something.
Yeah, I mean, I love that example. We've used it too, Andrew, because it's such a good comparison. Across Canada, we have choices for parents. You can put your kids in the government-run system, or you can pay for a private school, independent school, whatever. And the vast majority of Canadians still choose the public system, and that's totally fine. But when those some parents decide on private options, again, they're taking pressure off of those public school systems. The point about choice for workers is important. Here's a crazy number that we were able to calculate using some data from the state of Michigan, is that there's nearly 2,000 nurses who live in Ontario and get up each day for work, and they cross the border into Michigan, primarily working in the Detroit area. Like that is huge. And we talked to them, we surveyed them, we said, well, why are you doing this? And the number one reason, it actually wasn't compensation. It was the availability of work. They had the types of work, like positions that they wanted. But the second reason was compensation. And right behind it was working conditions. And many of them noted that they could get these jobs in Michigan. They were the way that they wanted them. They were full-time, came with benefits. They came with a predictable schedule. I mean, you had a competitive environment in Michigan where they were having employers competing to attract these workers and finding ways to give them the type of work arrangements that they wanted. Whereas in Ontario, they were looking at it and they're looking at the government system and saying, no, I just don't want to work there. And this has been a problem for a long time. You can't blame the current government. Can't blame even, I don't think, the former government, because it's the problem when you have this monopolistic environment.
To be honest, I wonder why. I understand why, but if you really think about it, it's quite surprising provinces haven't seen the opportunity in this. Because if you're a provincial government and you can come up with a pitch that you can make to voters, which is you will not pay more in taxes, you will not have any reduction in your care, but you will have this added option. And at the very least, even if you can't afford to use it, there will be fewer people on the wait list ahead of you in the public system to get it, because 2 or 3 of those folks will go to the system. You've actually eased the healthcare crisis without having to spend a dollar. And I really don't know why provincial governments have not been the ones to take the lead and call for that.
They're concerned about funding cutbacks from Ottawa.
But to bring the fight to Ottawa, let us do it. I mean, we see provinces on drug decriminalization saying, not as much anymore, but saying, hey, give us the right to do this. They could do the same thing provincially if they wanted to expend the political capital doing so.
They could. I think it would be wise for patients for them to do this. And the easiest I think, argument they can make going into Ottawa is, look, Ottawa, you're allowing Quebec to do this. Quebecers get more healthcare rights than anyone else in the country. We need to even the playing field and give all Canadians the same rights that Quebecers have. I think that's the argument that needs to be made if you're in BC, Alberta, wherever. I mean, the BC government obviously isn't going to make that argument, but certainly others could. In Ontario, Doug Ford could stand up and make that argument. We don't really look at this through a partisan lens, but the bottom line is it would help patients. And it makes sense for elected officials to do it. The public is behind them. This is, like I say, this isn't the debate from 20 years ago. The public has heard, they've seen governments do the same tired old approach of throwing money at the system, hoping something's going to work. It hasn't worked. It's failed. It's time to start looking at what these countries that perform better than Canada, what they do. And then we can start copying them and bring our standards up. And this is one thing among several changes that could be made to improve results for patients.
Colin Craig, always good to talk to you from secondstreet.org. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
All right, thank you. Well, that does it for us for today. I've been plugging it all week, so just to keep the whole set intact, let me tell you here what we have coming up in a couple of weeks. I'm going on a book tour. We are launching the release of my biography. You can see it back there. Well, you can't anymore, but you could see it back there. Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life, a biography that has had a fair bit of media interest. We'll be doing a launch event in Calgary on Wednesday, May 29th at the Ranchman's Club. Ooh, fancy. Going to Toronto at the Albany Club May 30th, and that is going to be at 4 p.m. That is at the Albany Club, and we're going to do something in Ottawa, I think June 5th. We're still finalizing those details, but you can get tickets, of which there are only a limited number left, at modernmiraclenetwork.org/Lawton, modernmiraclenetwork.org/Lawton, and I hope to see you out there. Get your copy, and I'll sign it if you want. It reduces the value though considerably if I sign it, but nevertheless, you have that option available to you. I'm going to be back tomorrow for Off the Record, which we'll be doing with a couple of cast of characters from True North. Next week, I am going to be away, and I'll be giving you updates. I'm going to be in Taiwan. We have been invited by the Taiwanese government, and part of the trip will be there for the presidential inauguration, which should be quite fun. I'm banned from covering government events in Canada, but I'm getting nice invitations to government events in Taiwan. So take from that what you will. But as we look at this country being a bulwark for freedom and democracy and a resistance against China, it is incredibly important. I'm glad to be able to go, and I'll have some updates sent back for you. But you will be in good hands because our good friend Chris Sims is going to be guest hosting next week from Tuesday to Thursday because we've got the holiday Monday. So I trust you will greet her with the enthusiasm that I greet her when she's on every Monday. But Chris Sims will be filling my shoes, my novelty size shoes, as a guest host next week. And then I'll be back in a couple of weeks' time. But all that being said, thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you. God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.